Hi, my name is James White, and my podcast is on the Mexican Revolution. More specifically, Ramon Ruiz's The Great Rebellion, which focuses on the revolution from 1905 through 1924. At the beginning of the book, in 1905, Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico. He didn't come to power easily. He actually lost the election of 1871 to then-President Benito Juarez. He believed he was cheated because the vote went to Mexican Congress, and that was full of Juaristas. He revolted in a plan called the Plan de la Noria, which ended in him gaining few supporters and the death of his brother. However, Juarez died in 1872 of a heart attack, and Diaz was able to defeat his successor, Sebastian Lerdo, in 1876, through another revolt under the Plan de Tuxtepec. Diaz was a very intelligent politician who could easily manipulate his people. In order to secure his power, he played his people and focused on satisfying the desires of different interest groups. By 1900, Diaz was becoming unpopular, even with his supporters. In an answer to his deteriorating image, Diaz censored the press. This led to the forming of the Mexican Liberal Party and the Cananea Strike in 1906. The people working in the Cananea mines wanted higher pay and for 75% of the jobs to go to the Mexican people. After all of their petitions had been ignored, over 3,000 people decided to march. This ended up in the death of some of the angry mob and in the death of the American-born employees in charge of that department. A 275-man posse led by the Arizona Rangers was called on to detain the rebellion. After all of this mess, the Mexican people wanted change. It was at this time that Francisco Madero began to gain popularity. James Krillman published an interview with Diaz in 1908 saying that he thought Mexico was ready for democracy and that the 1910 election should be free. Madero took this as an open invitation and wrote a book called The Presidential Succession of 1910. The book addressed the fact that even though Diaz had brought peace and economic growth to Mexico, the Mexican people had essentially lost their freedom. He gained a lot of popularity from the book and his mentioning of land reform, and he set out campaigning. It was obvious that Madero was popular with the Mexican people, so Diaz had him arrested and sent to San Antonio. This is when the real revolution started. Diaz was named winner of the election by a landslide, but it was obvious that the election had been fixed. This led to a call to arms by the Madero supporters. It is around this time that we are introduced to other important people in the revolution that the book focuses on. These people include Venustiano Carranza, Alvaro Obregon, Francisco Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata. Those men joined forces with Madero, which eventually led to the Diaz administration slowly falling apart. All this support, however, couldn't ultimately save his reputation. He was weak as a leader, and ended up angering both the radical revolutionists and the conservative counter-revolutionists. His time as leader was short-lived and was ended by a coup d'etat led by General Victoriano Huerta. Ironically, Huerta had been appointed by Madero when he first came to power, but he turned against him. Madero was forced to resign and was shot to death less than a week later by army officers who were transporting him to jail. When Venustiano Carranza, who was now governor of Coahuila, got word of Huerta's overthrow of Madero, he was unsurprised. Carranza's relationship with Madero had deteriorated around this time because he believed Madero was too weak of a leader, which ultimately led to him being overthrown. Carranza offered Madero refuge anyway, but wasn't quick enough to stop his execution. Carranza saw this as an open opportunity to seize power and declared his area in a state of rebellion. He was named first chief of the Constitutional Army and drafted a new constitution called the Plan of Guadalupe. This essentially only promised to restore the old constitution of 1857 without promised social reforms. He met with Adolfo de la Huerta, who was heading a delegation from Sonora, and got the Sonorans to agree to his plan. Around this same time, Alvaro Obregon was raising an army for Carranza in Sonora. Carranza divided the country into 7 operational zones and launched the revolution in 1913. Things did not go so well at first, and he was forced to flee to the rebel stronghold of Sonora. Even though they weren't experiencing much success, his army was growing. In March 1914, Carranza got word of Pancho Villa's victories and of the advances Obregon was making, and decided he was safe to leave Sonora. Although Pancho Villa was helping him, he also made a lot of messes for Carranza to clean up. When some 2,300 American Navy troops were sent in to occupy Veracruz during this time, a fight broke out and ended with 22 Navy troops and nearly 200 Mexicans dead. Carranza requested the removal of the troops and said that American President Woodrow Wilson should take up his complaints against Huerta to try to please the U.S. government. Villa stepped out from under Carranza's foreign policy. Although the alliance between Carranza, Obregon, Villa, and Emiliano Zapata was uneasy, they led the rebels to victory. The fight against Huerta formally ended in August 1914. This set up Carranza as the strongest candidate to fill the vacancy. Although they fought against Huerta's government, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata had some differing ideas than Carranza, and they formally broke ties with him. Obregon stayed loyal to Carranza and used his skills as a tactician to portray Villa as nothing more than a self-centered bandit in the press. After a decisive victory over Villa in the Battle of Celaya, the current interim president of Mexico, Francisco Pizarro, surrendered. By October 1915, Carranza was recognized as president of Mexico by the U.S., and by the end of that same year, Pancho Villa was on the run. By 1917, Mexico passed a new constitution. The Constitution of 1917 actually differed greatly from what Carranza wanted. This same year, Carranza finally became constitutional president of Mexico. It was an easy victory, with Villa and Zapata on the run. Zapata would eventually be captured and assassinated. Carranza's run as constitutional president was fairly short-lived, with little high points. He was able to stay neutral during World War I, but remained uncertain about Articles 3 and 130 of the new Constitution, because he had opposed them at the Constitutional Convention. He tried to mollify these provisions, but was rejected by 2/3 of Mexican Congress. In 1920, Carranza decided not to run for re-election. Obregon was the obvious natural successor, but Carranza supported obscure diplomat Ignacio Bonillas, because he felt the next president shouldn't be a general. After Obregon's supporters were repressed and killed, Obregon himself decided Carranza wouldn't leave office peacefully. He renewed the revolution, and with the help of other Sonoran generals, Carranza was driven out of Mexico, betrayed, and killed on his way to regroup at Veracruz. Adolfo de la Huerta became interim president of Mexico after Carranza's death. It wasn't long after until Obregon was elected. Obregon made educational reforms, building 1,000 rural schools and 2,000 public libraries. He also created a Department of Labor and a labor-friendly Minister of Industry and Commerce. He also enforced constitutional land reform. When he was unable to run for re-election in 1924, he endorsed Plutarco Elias Calles. This angered de la Huerta because he felt like he should be the next president of Mexico. He organized an uprising against Obregon that actually included some of his former comrades. Obregon's forces crushed the rebels' uprising and hunted down many of his former friends and had them executed. Calles was elected president in 1924, and Obregon stepped down. The point that Ruiz tries to make in this book is that many scholars of contemporary Mexico never really questioned the way Diaz's regime fell and how the other men I mentioned came to power. Many Mexican scholars refer to this period of time as the Revolution with a capital R. The point he tries to make is, by definition, a revolution is not only a change of rulers, but also the dawn of a new age in the sense of economic, social, and political affairs. This really is not so for most of these men. It is not until Obregon until we start to see some real reform. That is why he believes it is more a great rebellion, hence the title of the book, because most of these men came to power revolting and rebelling against the current ruler of the time. I had never really thought about it that way until I took a look at this book, and after doing so, I have to agree with Ruiz. The Mexican Revolution saw many rulers and many different constitutions, but no real change until Obregon came to power. And this is why Ruiz refers to it as the Great Rebellion.